Welcome, everyone. The Kutsche Office of Local History is really excited to have you here today. So first, my name is Kimberly McKee, and I'm the director of the Kutsche Office of Local History. The Kutsche Office of Local History and the Brooks College of Interdisciplinary Studies at Grand Valley State University, our mission is to give voice to diverse communities through history. We firmly believe in working with communities, recognizing the importance of building reciprocal, mutually beneficial relationships with communities. So between us, our organization, local historians, and other community organizations that we partner with. We're excited to have Dani Willcutt joining us today to discuss how race shaped travel and leisure in her analysis of the experiences of Black Americans in Michigan in early to mid 20th century, encompassing the Great Migration through the Civil Rights Act. So Lansing native Dani Willcutt graduated from GVSU in 2010, double majoring in history and international relations. Working in restaurants and bars inspired her to pursue a degree in gastronomy from Boston University, where she focused on food policy issues and sustainable tourism. Willcutt is back studying food and history in her home state, working on a PhD in history from Michigan State University. There, she works with the largely migrant Latinx and Black populations that undergird the region's restaurant and tourism industry. Please know that if you do have questions for Dani, that you can put them in the Q&A chat. And please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available online later. We also have pre-submitted questions. And so while we hope to get to all of the questions during Q&A, we most likely will not. And so thank you in advance for understanding. Now I'm pleased to turn this over to Dani. Please join me in welcoming her today.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Kim, for that wonderful introduction. I'm very happy to be here today with everyone, and now I shall jump into it and share my screen. This over. Okay, so the working title of my project is Leisure Can Be Resistance To, Traveling While Black in Michigan, 1930 to 1964. And just in case you have any questions, I've included my email also. Oops. Oh, there we go. Okay. I guess I don't need to even do an introduction, but just a little bit of a background so you understand how I came to have these questions and to ask the questions that I'm going to present to you today. My primary field right now at Michigan State University is labor and leisure history, broadly speaking. My dissertation will research centers on Michigan's restaurant industry and its relationship to the auto industry in industrial cities like Lansing, Flint, Detroit, and Saginaw. I grew up here in Lansing, but have spent most of my adult life living in Grand Rapids and Boston. And before moving to Lansing to attend MSU, I lived in Boston working as a culinary coordinator, where I helped organize international cooking classes, festivals, that sort of thing. And then while I was also receiving my master's at Boston University in gastronomy, as well as a certificate in economic development via sustainable tourism management. Quite a mouthful. My master's thesis there presented the socioeconomic impact of the Kentucky Bourbon Trail on the state of Kentucky. For more than 2 years, I researched the bourbon industry while questioning what it meant to have bourbon as a cultural heritage product, but that talk is for another day. By the end of the project, I began questioning the practice of placemaking that was required in creating an entire tourism industry centered on a single product, bourbon whiskey made in Kentucky. Placemaking is a process by which the managers of said place determine who the target audience is for that space. Deciding on a target audience, however, necessarily requires making a decision about who is not the preferred audience. And so these questions of placemaking, I never stopped thinking about, and this is what has led me to this project. A mentor of mine, Dr. Darlene Clark-Hine, Always tell students that the questions are the most important part of any inquiry, and it is with this in mind that I continue to push at the edges of our understanding, and it is in this spirit that I will now move on to the topic of today's presentation. Today, my preliminary question is, why did Idlewild exist? Why was an all-black resort town needed in the middle of West Michigan? And then this helps move into a larger question of what does this reveal about Michigan's sociocultural history? Next, I will discuss the auto industry, which cannot be separated from the story of travel and tourism in Michigan. And finally, I'll discuss the importance of the Negro Motorist Green Book, what it can tell us about Michigan, but most importantly, we will take a look through some of the pages together. I will leave you all with some sources for further information at the end because there are a lot of neat digital sources available, and I hope that this inspires you to check some of them out. To this day, families can be found splashing around in Lake Idlewild on a hot summer's day, barbecuing and enjoying each other's company. But during other times of the year, one would not be remiss to look at the now desolate former beach town and call it a ghost town. At its prime, the Idlewild Resort welcomed tens of thousands of tourists every summer. Some were there to enjoy the talented entertainers at the infamous Flamingo Club, while others stayed for the entire summer in their private vacation homes. But today, Idlewild exists as a sign of a bygone era, engulfed by the Huron-Manistee National Forest, encapsulating a dark history of inequality in the Midwest, as well as a story of hope and perseverance despite it all. Today, Idlewild appears as a land that time forgot. The buildings that are remaining are preserved in their original early modern 20th century style. I have an example of a store that has been, it's still there and I believe still in working order. But then over here in this photo, if you can follow my cursor, the photo on the right, you see that a lot of the buildings are now overgrown, although some of them still have inhabitants. Some historic markers point the way for anyone interested in visiting. There's a restaurant, a museum, a post office, a store, but at least during our current time of shutdowns, um, hours are limited, more than usual even. The case of Idlewild is not like in other destinations where a lack of tourists suggested a failure on the part of the destination's managers or planners. Idlewild provided a respite for Black Americans from the bigotry they faced daily. For Black elites from cities like Chicago and Detroit, Idlewild became a respite where they did not have to worry about their families or children encountering embarrassing and even dehumanizing situations. Vacationing in an all-Black resort was, for Black families, an effective tool for insulating their family and for enjoying their hard-earned leisure time. And here are a couple pictures. You'll also see over here we have a photo from Lake of Paradise in Baldwin, Michigan. Baldwin is very close to Idlewild as well, and the whole area seems to have been a vacation land, all serving the same purpose. The resort town was actually developed in 1918 by a group of white investors who recognized the need for an all-Black resort town, especially during when it started. There was a rising Black leisure class, a professional class of doctors, lawyers, of folks who needed a safe place to go and a place to spend their money. And so the folks who created Idlewild recognized this and created this resort town, which would flourish. Yeah, and so in this case, it didn't matter how much money one had. They just needed to find a place where they could go and enjoy. Just take a look. Okay, because tourism in Michigan in particular offers us a critical lens through which we can examine the racial inequities driving the necessity of Idlewild. Leisure spaces So the reason why Idlewild provided a respite is that leisure spaces were often highly contested, especially in the early 20th century. Um, in 1919, for example, most of this talk today, I'm focusing on the 1930s and 40s, but it's important to understand some of the other um, stuff that was going on in the state and in the region. A lot of the folks who were staying in Idlewild came from Chicago and Detroit, from the large cities. Um, and so the reason they had to leave those cities, though, in 1919, for example, there was a riot that broke out in Chicago that began when a young African American boy was swimming in Lake Michigan and he accidentally, unknowingly, crossed the invisible segregation line that told him he was not to be swimming in the white area, and chaos ensued, which I will not go into too much detail about right now. Another example later in 1943 in Detroit, um, over 20 years before the 1967 rebellion in Detroit, there was a riot that broke out in um, on Detroit's Belle Isle. It was a hot summer day, and tensions arose. This photo of an overturned car is from that. I'm sorry, it's a little blurry. I noticed when I um, blew it up, but you get the point. Um, and so that was Belle Isle at the time. There was It was segregated, of course. So there was a black side and a white side to where you could actually enjoy the beach. And the black beach was also part of a more industrial side. It wasn't as pretty as the white beach on Belle Isle. And so there was a lot of tension that came out of this. Um, Recreational spaces in particular became highly contested spaces where racial and social tensions fomented. After World War I, Western culture was quickly shifting and modernizing. The Industrial Revolution ushered in a new era of wage earning, and young folks were keen to make their own money, as well as to spend it on modern leisures like the movie theater, the amusement park, the beach. These spaces also pushed moral boundaries as they led to mixing between males and females. Moral boundaries were being pushed and tested from all sides, and recreational spaces tended to be where these tensions would boil over into a fight, and you would have something happen, like in Detroit at Belle Isle. Um, and as though it was not enough that young men and young women were spending more and more unsupervised time with one another in recreational spaces, urban areas also meant pushing racial boundaries as well. Um, and here I simply have a quote from Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. It is a Pulitzer Prize winning book about the Great Migration. And the quote is, contrary to modern day assumptions, for much of the history of the United States, from the draft riots of the 1860s to the violence over desegregation a century later, riots were often carried out by disaffected whites against groups perceived as threats to their survival. Thus, riots would become to the North what lynchings were to the South, each a display of uncontained rage by put upon people directed toward the scapegoats of their condition. Nearly every big northern city experienced one or more during the 20th century. And I will return a little bit to this topic, but we will move into the automobile now in the essence of time. We can't tell a story of travel and tourism in Michigan without also talking about the automobile. The automobile is a central facet of any story regarding travel and tourism in the early 20th century US. But the automobile also plays a large role in Michigan's history as a whole. Leisure time was historically enjoyed by the upper classes, the class of folks who could afford to live lavishly instead of tinkering away in a factory, and they could afford to travel. The automobile changed all of this by democratizing travel. For Michigan in particular, Tourism became a method for promoting environmental concerns as well as for raising revenue for the state. While the railroad had had a significant effect on travel and movement in the 19th century, the 20th century belonged to the automobile. Automobiles became more affordable, which in turn made auto travel more accessible. In addition to the state and interstate highway developments, the automobile made it easier, cheaper, and faster to travel across long distances. By the 1930s, families had even taken to staying in auto camps, where they would set up their camp outside of the family automobile. Auto camps became places where the temporarily transient could meet each other, share stories of the road, and live in a way unlike their lives at home. Auto camps also became a necessity for Black families who were traveling, who were not necessarily welcome into available lodging, no matter how much money they wanted to spend. And we also need to include Michigan's auto industry. The story of Michigan's auto industry is not complete without also discussing the Great Migration. The Great Migration has a name that suggests a singular movement, but there were in fact two waves. The first wave of the Great Migration came around World War I, and the Great Migration. And it brought Southerners, Black and white, it brought them up from the South. The second wave came in accordance to World War II because during the wars, there was more need of industrial labor in the factories in the North as they were creating like wartime stuff. And there was also, even though there was the pull of employment and better treatment, freedom from lynchings, which, as I mentioned, is even a little bit problematic here. It still, it was also, they were also pushed out of the South. Southerners also left the South because there were lynchings. There was the boll weevil destroyed crops in the South, especially the cotton crop, which meant there's no work available essentially. And so there were more opportunities in the North for them. Sorry. So I want to bring your attention though to, if you can see this Jacob Lawrence painting. This is panel number 35. Jacob Lawrence created the set of 62 paintings in 1940 to 1941. He himself was a Black migrant from the South who was also an artist, as you can see. And each of these panels that he designed tells another story of the Great Migration. And so I included a couple of these here because I think they do a good job of telling the story. And here he writes, they left the South in large numbers and they arrived in the North in large numbers. And I'm going to move on to, there we go. And so another reason Black-owned newspapers like the Chicago Defender, that one was owned by Robert S. Abbott, served as boosters for the Great Migration. Black-owned and operated newspapers connected Black Americans with one another with the aim of racial uplift. These newspapers became a conduit through which Black folks could share information with one another over large distances. The Defender was pivotal in urging Black Southerners to leave the South and to head north. The Defender would share stories of lynchings and other racial violence, but it would also share stories on a sort of society page. For example, in Idlewild's early years, the Defender would celebrate anytime Black society folks were off to their summer home in Idlewild, anytime they purchased a new home. Purchasing a vacation home and enjoying leisure time were moments celebrated by the Black press. And it was so important that we see that Jacob Lawrence included stories of the Defender. He included that as a theme within um, his migration panels. And next, we're going to move on to travel guides, a story of travel guides, because this story is also not complete without discussing the Green Book. But first, by the 1920s, more than half of all middle-class American households owned an automobile. In hopes of making money off of the booming industry, automobile, gas, oil, and tire companies led the way in providing pamphlets and literature on auto maintenance as well as on travel. The Michelin Guide, for example. It was first published in France, but it is also one of the earliest and perhaps the most famous example of the success and readership of early travel guides. Brothers Andre and Edouard Michelin created the 1900 Michelin Guide in order to incite automobile travel. The more folks drove, the more often they would need to purchase tires, which is perfect for a company like Michelin who sold tires. They would add in restaurant reviews and suggestions, eventually leading to the world-class ranking of restaurants based on Michelin stars that still exists today. In the global dining scene, earning 3 Michelin stars means reaching the epitome of restaurant quality, but in its beginning, it was only a travel guide. AAA, on the other hand, a Chicago-based company, designed a blue book for travelers in 1902 that shared restaurants, hotels, and services in general. It was a useful guide for travelers on the road. It made traveling to faraway places less worrisome for travelers who did not always know what to expect. Another book, however, came a little bit later and was the Negro Motorist Green Book, first published much later in 1936, became not only an effective tool for navigating the unknown on a road trip, but a necessary travel companion for Black travelers. And just like with AAA and with the Michelin Guide, the Green Book also benefited from corporate sponsorship. Not every company was on board um, with promoting the Green Book. However, Esso Oil was one company who realized there was a lot of money to be made from this market, and they even created and so Esso also, I have this photo over here. They actually created an African American marketing team, and which was a really big step at that time. And Esso also helped make it possible for the Green Book to be accessible and findable in all of their gas stations across the country. Okay, and now a little bit of context into a little bit more of the historical context of the Green Book. The Green Book was first created in 1936 by Victor H. Green, a postman in New York City. As a Black man during the 1930s, he had to rely on his knowledge of different neighborhoods to know which was the best route to take. Even in the forward-thinking, cosmopolitan locales such as New York City, people of color lived and operated in fear of prejudice and racial violence, both physical and psychological. Although he was living in New York City, race relations were tenuous at best. Northern states were overall friendlier to Blacks than were Southern states. There was more employment available to both Black men and women, and the fear of lynching was not as dire in the North as in the South. Life was comparatively better in the North, but the racial tensions and segregation existed. In fact, segregation was not overturned in the US until 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education case overturning Plessy versus Ferguson, which had stated accommodations would be separate but equal. In the North, Black laborers would oftentimes be used as strike breakers, meaning that employers I'm going to skip 2 different sections, sorry. To understand the time in which Victor Green published the first Green Book, let us remember that the 1930s were ushered in by the stock market crash of 1929. This led to years of economic instability and the Great Depression. Nonetheless, um, labor made great strides, namely the 1935 Wagner Act, also known as the National Labor Relations Act. This allowed workers to organize, use striking as a method of resistance, and to engage in collective bargaining. And while the 1930s were good for labor when considering the strides made by organizations like the AFL and the CIO, um, workers' rights weren't fully extended to African American laborers in the industrial North. Companies like the Ford Motor Company would use Black workers as strikebreakers, which heightened racial tensions. For the most part, Black workers were given menial jobs and were limited from working on the assembly line next to the white coworkers. In addition to trouble on the labor line, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, an entity responsible for giving out loans, undertook a study into 239 major urban areas. The idea this was 1935 to 1936. The idea was to assess these urban areas for the viability of awarding loans. In reality, the four-tiered rating system unevenly affected Black neighborhoods. Many of the Black neighborhoods, in fact, were given the following label. The fourth grade or grade D areas represent those neighborhoods in which the things that are now taking place in the C neighborhoods have already happened. They are characterized by detrimental influences to a pronounced degree, undesirable population or an infiltration of it. Low percentage of home ownership, very poor maintenance, and often vandalism prevail. Unstable incomes of the people and difficult collections are usually prevalent. The areas are broader than the so-called neighborhoods, and others will lend only on a conservative basis. In the fourth grade, or grade D, neighborhoods were represented on maps with red, thus the term redlining. The result was that those neighborhoods deemed too risky to invest in were never invested in, and the cycle continued. This was the world that Black Americans were navigating during the 1930s and why the Green Book was necessary. So now I want us to start looking inside of one of the Green Books. This is from, we'll go back, from this 1948 issue. And there would be an introduction, and I thought that looking at this would be, it's easier for me to show you than to just talk about it, and I think it's more interesting this way. The Green Book became the official travel guide for Black Americans shortly after it was published, the official travel guide. It differed from AAA and Michelin in a few key ways. First, it was mostly crowdsourced by just normal folks. Folks could write into the Green Book office and share stories of their experiences, positive or negative, so that the book could be updated for the next annual issue. There was one issue per year. And so here I thought it was interesting because the introduction compares it, the Green Book, to the AAA Blue Book. I don't actually know if it was supposed to be a play on that or just named for Victor Green or both. It might be both. But here he wrote, the white traveler for years has had no difficulty in getting accommodations, but with the Negro, it's been different. He has his own travel guide that he can depend on for all the information that he wants and with a selection. Hence, these guides have made traveling more popular and without running into embarrassing situations. Those embarrassing situations being denied a place to stay for the night, being denied lodging, being denied a place at a diner, being denied food, being denied a place to use a restroom. All of this could happen. And I wanted to give everyone an idea also of the Green Book locations in Michigan. I have an ongoing list of the locations in Michigan where this is not a map that I made. I wish I could say I made this map, but I just thought it looks great, and I will have a link to it at the end of the presentation. But here someone has gone through and mapped all the locations from the 1956 edition. You can't see from this photo, but at this point, it had also extended into Bermuda, Mexico, excuse me, Puerto Rico. And so it was now international as well. And you can see where here, in this area up here, this is where Idlewild is. Idlewild and Baldwin, all located up here. And as you can see, they're kind of like few and far between. And so if you didn't have a safe place to go, but you're driving from Chicago up to here or Detroit over to here, that's a long way to go and to not know for sure if you're going to have a place to stay for the night. And then, as I said, yeah, I want us to look at the inside of the green books. I'll include a link at the end as well, because it's possible to look at the New York Public Library through the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. They have digitized copies of all of the green books. And so it's really neat to be able to look through them and see what it looks like on the inside. And so there would usually be an index. Once again, this one is from 1948. And there would be an index from all of the states. The very early ones didn't even include all of the states, but Michigan had always been included, especially locations in Detroit, Lansing, all of the industrial cities in Michigan, especially. And the next part, and so there would always be a sort of like disclaimer, or not a disclaimer, but the explanation for why it was needed, the aims of the Green Book. And I find it interesting that it says here, no travel guide is ever perfect with the changing conditions, not only in the world, but also in the US. And so you see that this was the Green Books are a sort of living document that were needed up until 1967. I'm realizing now, I think I forgot to say that it began in 1936, but then ended in 1967. It ended shortly after the passing of the Civil Rights Act, because suddenly these spaces were no longer needed. But I want to look over, and so there would be these letters, but back to the Green Book. There would be letters at the beginning of each of the issues, writing and sharing their experiences. And so I took this one and made it larger so we can see it a little better. But I found this very interesting and telling of the time. The attitude of a majority of those I contacted was that, while they themselves had no color prejudice, and this is in North Dakota, some of their regular customers did have. This was the impression I gained from hotel operators, barbers, and others contacted. They were all eager to provide whatever services were required by Negroes visiting Dickinson. Ignorance is the root of prejudice. There's a special type of ignorance in this section regarding Negroes. There are so few living in North Dakota that a colored person is still a curiosity. And I think that these letters to the editor tell of the slow cultural changes that were coming to the US during the 1930s and the 1940s. And that we really need to think about those in terms of how it created or did not create a safe space for those who were trying to go on vacation and enjoy their leisure time and enjoy their hard-earned leisure time. And next, I took the 2 pages also from this one. I took the 2 that just have Michigan locations listed. it's very interesting to look. A lot of these locations no longer exist. And that's all for, because they've been developed, or I know in the case of Lansing, for example, um, this area that had originally been, a lot of these locations are in what had historically been a Black neighborhood. But we had an interstate here in Lansing. I live in Lansing. We had an interstate come in, 496, separated and split and broke up that entire neighborhood and separated it. And these locations just don't exist anymore. But it is interesting to see, for example, Bitely seems very random, but that was around one of the locations that the Civilian Conservation Corps had. It was one of, in the 1933, Civilian Conservation Corps began, and that was part of a New Deal, one of FDR's New Deal policies that had, they were used to plant trees. The Civilian Conservation Corps, they planted trees, they dug lakes and added fish to them and created, um, and they reversed a lot of the extractive industry that had wreaked havoc on Michigan up until the early 20th century, lumber, mining, that sort of thing. Um, but but it was, the CCC was segregated. They had originally tried to be integrated. Fights broke out, so there were Black regiments, there were Native American regiments, there was even female. There were even female regiments. The she, very cute. And so the Black regiment was located around Bitely. Long story. It was located around Bitely. And so when you look into these, I found that you learn a lot more by just looking at a hotel in Bitely, or there are so many stories like hidden within these pages that are just waiting to be found. And so I'll leave you with, before we go into this, kind of some of my final thoughts. Tourism and travel history exists as a subaltern historical field, but what sparse literature exists focuses predominantly on the narratives of white and middle to upper class travelers. This is an issue whether you're thinking of like managing a tourism industry, or if you're thinking about it historically. You really have to think about the subaltern and those who are existing on the margins and thinking outside of just the status quo, I guess. And while leisure historians are attempting to widen historical scholarship to include African American travel experiences, among other groups, there's still a considerable amount of work to be done within this critical space. Fully examining Michigan's history of tourism requires not only embracing the story of the winter wonderland or a water wonderland, or even today a pure Michigan, but also questioning the structures that simultaneously created spaces of respite and enforced segregation. There's still a lot more to learn and more stories to uncover, but I hope that what I've shared with you today is at least a good start. And I want to point everyone toward further readings and viewing, because today, and there's not enough time to go into all of the details I would really like to share with everybody, but there's a lot of cool work happening within this, what I consider a critical space. And for example, when you're thinking of a great film to watch, it was produced by the Smithsonian and directed, and narrated by Yoruba Ricken. I hope I'm saying that right. And she produced this documentary, The Green Book Guide to Freedom, in 2019 in conjunction with the Smithsonian. It's really fantastic, and I highly recommend. Another book that examines and considers um, these issues of recreational space as contested space is Victoria Wolcott's Race, Riots, and Roller Coasters from 2012. If you're interested just in Idlewild, I recommend Ronald J. Stevens' Idlewild book. And this link I've included here, oops, it will take you to a fuller list of further readings and viewings. I need to check it. I think I need to fix something on it, but it will take you, at least by the end of the day, to a more full list. And another thing, the Green Books digital collection is all available digitally online, nypl.org. And also, this happens to be, I hadn't realized initially that the timing would, work out this way. But the MSU Broad Museum, which is an art museum, recently, just this last week, it just opened this weekend, opened up a this Interstates of Being exhibit, which I was one of the I did the historical research on it along with another colleague. And so this is it's really neat, and I do recommend it. You can see some stuff online. It is free if you chose to go to Lansing and see it, but you can actually see some of the green books and postcards, and it really talks about the role of the automobile in simultaneously democratizing travel, but also the work that I've talked about today is all included in here as well. So I thought that would be interesting to mention. That's all I have prepared, but I know that there are a lot of questions. So I can hand it over to, here, let me stop sharing.
So Dani, thank you for such a wonderful presentation. It was really great. We did receive some questions, and we also, like I said before, had some pre-submitted questions. And so I think one of the questions as people are thinking about this is, how did Black travelers drive to tourist destinations like Idlewild? Were they following paths mapped out in the Green Book, thinking about places where it'd be safe to stop? Or were they also traveling on the same interstates and highways that you would obviously see white travelers going on and that kind of thing?
That's a good question. It would be both. It would be both. As the interstates, they were able to take advantage of the interstates. And I think there's a couple different, it kind of depends on the specific time, really, because before the interstates, before the highways really existed, they would have to, just travel by auto car, or the auto camp style, I guess, or perhaps be able to take a train part of the way. But later, after the interstates, they could absolutely just, the Green Book wouldn't give a specific trail, but would give you specific just stops that were safe more than a path itself. Does that answer?
That totally makes sense. Just thinking about sort of how the Green Book laid out particular destinations that were considered safe, so that way if you were mapping out where you're going, you could use that as a guide. So thinking about, I guess, sort of travel and leisure more broadly then, were there certain factors that were making communities more or less popular for Black travelers? So thinking about the rise of different communities, say, such as Idlewild, right? So thinking about how did these communities become known for being safe havens for certain areas? For instance, we know Saugatuck and Douglas was sort of seen as a safe haven for LGBTQ folks in the mid 20th century. And so how did that play? How did that happen in the Black community as well?
I think it was definitely the word of mouth and the boosterism from the newspapers and really word of mouth. Learning from each other and from actually with auto travel as a whole for everybody at the beginning of like auto camps and this sort of thing. Um, word of mouth about destinations and parks and stuff was really important. And that was also true within this community that I've been talking about because they were able to know if it was unsafe or they were able to learn about like sundown towns, for example. Um, which is a big key thing I think I should have mentioned earlier. But like sundown towns existed, which meant the sun better not, if the sun sets and a Black person is still out and about, they are in trouble. Whether that was through, like community policing or actual policing, it was dangerous. And they would learn this from like word of mouth and have an idea of the spaces. Because even in Michigan, there are only three official sundown towns. But in the 1920s, there was that resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, for example. And in Michigan, um, in the 1920s, the KKK was largely involved with labor and the auto industry. And these are things that were shared and celebrated even and had parades for them. So it was very well known. But also, Ottawa County had the highest amount of Klan members actually in like the 1920s and 30s in Michigan. And so there are these moments, or this information would have been like passed around and understood as these are the unsafe places to go because these are the cultural norms there and these are the experiences and this is what's happened before. Um, and so when you had a place like Idlewild that was created specifically for um, Black tourism, I think it just, yeah, I think I, does that answer? Sorry.
No, it does. And I mean, I think thinking about sort of both the resurgence of the Klan as well as where it was located helps sort of round out that portrait or understanding of not only what cities were absent from the Green Book, from the pages that you shared with us in your presentation in Michigan, right? So thinking about what cities or what towns were not included, but also thinking too about how Klan membership not only focused on kind of a white supremacist ideology, but how Klan membership also bled over into these other industries to perhaps also affect communities and towns. But you keep mentioning auto camps, and I'm wondering for those who might not be familiar with the term, could you just define that for folks?
Yeah. Um, auto camps, it's essentially camping, but out of the vehicle. And folks would set up like once the cars became something that every family just sort of had. Um, it became a way to travel without having to worry about train schedules or anybody's schedule. It was this like way of being like a free and transient individual for just a short amount of time, even. And to take the family and to create like camps. And they would meet up in, um, like campgrounds and stuff that eventually added on fees, but originally did not have fees, actually. They added the fees later to sort of population control in a way. Um, and that's something I wish I knew more about specifically in Michigan about how they decided to start charging for it. But yeah, it was essentially just like a campsite, but made using your car included too. And people would get pretty fancy with them too to make it into their like home away from home.
Oh, wow. So that's really interesting. So I guess I'm thinking too about how then these auto camps and just automobiles in general really helped democratize who could travel, but also too thinking about the way segregation played a role in any public transportation. And so during this time period. So then I guess I'm wondering, what changed about Black tourism, I guess, if you think about before and after, say, World War II?
I think after World War II, it's interesting because that's like the second wave of the Great Migration. And so, which is also related to the automobile because the industry not only like brought people, but the automobile was one way that people traveled north. There was the train. Um, Later, the Greyhound bus also was important, but there was also the automobiles. The beginning. I lost my train of thought. What was? I am so sorry. What was? Oh yeah, the 1940s.
No,
I just
sure.
started thinking of.
Yeah.
And so afterward, I think social relations did slowly start to change a little bit like after World War II. But of course, in 1943, we also had the huge riot like in the middle, in Detroit, right in the middle of the war. But afterwards, there was even Idlewild had seen a resurge, like, and not a resurgence because it didn't stop, but it got even more popular, where the nightclubs started bringing in musicians and just performers and entertainers from all over, like world class acts, all of the biggest acts of the day. And it became a resort space in the 1940s and 50s for that. Also, white folks were coming up to see the music too and to enjoy the nightclubs and stuff, and to take part in that culture. And I think it just was like slowly changing. But then there was also the issue of class stratification too, because when Idlewild began, at least, um, it was mostly for places for like doctors to go. For example, Daniel Hale Williams, who was the first person to successfully conduct an open heart surgery. He was a black man and he was one of the first most affluent people to have a house in Idlewild. And so it had begun as it had begun as a more affluent place, but then later it became, I think, as tourism as a whole became more accessible for more people because more people had a disposable income or a little bit, and they had more leisure time. Also, they had things like a weekend and the 8-hour workday. Um, and so they were able to go and enjoy it in a different way, I guess. So then, yeah, there was class stratification. And eventually, um, Idlewild just stopped being popular because it wasn't needed anymore. Segregation ended in 1954. Not that that did not welcome in myriad problems in its own, um, but it started to change things. And so then everybody could have access to somewhere like Belle Isle, for example.
So, I mean, wow, your response has me thinking and with a few different questions. So I'm going to apologize now if my questions seem a little unorganized, but as you were sharing, I guess there's a few things because you brought up sort of the need to have an intersectional understanding about who is vacationing in Idlewild, right? So it wasn't just Black Americans, it was Black Americans of a particular kind of class. But at the same time, what struck me was the fact that you sort of highlighted the fact that as sort of more nationally recognized musical acts or cultural icons of the era were coming to Idlewild, so were white folks. And so I think that's sort of really important because we hear about white people going into Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance and afterwards, right, to hear Black musicians and that kind of thing. But very rarely do we think about that happening within our own communities or at least within our own regional area of West Michigan. And that's really important to note to really understand the fact that Black Americans have always had such a huge cultural impact on white America, and yet um, the way in which white America is accepting of Black folks, whether it's through sort of ending segregation, trying to fight for racial justice, it's always been very uneven, right? So thinking about that exchange. So I'm curious then, as your, if we know that sort of wealthier Black Americans were going to Idlewild, what were, I guess, working class Black folks doing at the time? Were they going to sort of Black only or Black specific auto camp sites? Were they were there, I'm assuming there was, but were there sort of, were these auto camps mainly racially segregated as they were kind of operating, right? And then, where were these kind of working class Black folks going to vacation as you had things like the 8-hour workday, the establishment of weekends, thanks to the work of labor unions?
Thinking, these are good questions that I feel like it's like, yeah, I wish I knew more about some of this. Like, it's the projects are never done. Um I would say, like, especially when Idlewild began in 1910, or 1919, and then into the 1920s, um there were still, I would say, labor relations weren't what they would become. And so there wasn't even as much access to leisure and recreational time. And so that's a major issue for the working class, is simply, did they even have the time or the income or the ability to go do something like that? Um and sometimes for the auto camp, in, like, specifically for African Americans traveling, they might have to, like, their auto camp might not be at an actual, like, place, but might just have to be where they can find, like, on the side of the road or something, because at the time it wasn't space, and, like, land wasn't as like now, if I just set up a tent on the side of the highway, someone would question me. But I think it would be, like, a little different at the time. I'm thinking more of, like, in Scotland, where you can camp anywhere. But that's my impression of the situation.
Okay, no, that's really helpful to think about too. How we understand space and place has obviously evolved,
Yeah.
especially thinking about when automobiles first were kind of being used by many folks, sort of in terms of the increasing ownership of the auto. But also thinking too about just Black travelers overall, I guess. What you mentioned, sort of within looking at the Green Book, the places in and around Lansing are no longer there. And so I'm wondering if you just, because I think this also touches upon the work that you were doing with the museum that you referenced at the end of your presentation, right? And
Yeah.
so how did the building of highways then affect Black communities? I mean, that once, in terms of thinking about those places that were safe havens listed in the Green Book, right? And I know the building of highways has definitely evolved, but we see this more. And I know this falls outside the scope of your presentation, because we talk a lot about sort of the way buildings of highways have negatively shaped communities of color, right? Sort of post 1960s, right?
Yeah.
So thinking about deindustrialization and that sort of thing. But my question, I think, focuses more on what were sort of highways, how did highways shape Black communities from sort of in that early period? Like, did you guys find anything when you were doing that research, or were you mainly sort of thinking about sort of like a post 65 kind of moment?
For that, I think when we were doing that research, it was more thinking about the highway system and how it affected everybody, thinking of it more in as a whole. But then, like, being in Lansing, we just could not, there's no, like, leaving that story of 496 out of the conversation. And I know that there are other examples of this that I can't think of right now. But I guess, even I think New York City would provide us a good example. Um where like city planners, at least thinking about I-496 in Lansing, city planners would look at a map and think about where do they not expect businesses to go, or it could be something like that. And it's unfortunately showing, I think it unfortunately reveals that city planners simply saw that area as a place that was okay to get rid of and that was okay to separate. And kind of poking at that and thinking about why they thought that was okay and why that is okay, like really just leads to more and more questions that, yeah, I don't have a good answer for right now. But
No, sure. I mean, I think,
yeah,
yeah, you're right. Thinking about the way city planning is affected by sort of racial bias and understandings of value in terms of
yeah,
communities, and community histories, and what we're interested in invested in preserving. And so thinking about sort of your presentation, right? And so thinking about, from the Great Migration to, the Civil Rights Act and that sort of thing, on average, if you're thinking about a particular time period, do you know how many Black moving around during that
yeah,
time? You know, is that something that people were able to sort of measure and assess? Because I'm not even sure.
yeah. I have it's like I always try to find good visuals that I think are can do a better job. I don't know. I just think visuals can do a better job of explaining things sometimes. Um, so if I can, um, let's, sorry, let me come back here. Sorry, computers, I've lost it. But there is a wonderful, I mean, it was tens of thousands, there were millions of folks who moved from the South throughout the both of the waves. And actually, since 1970, 1980, there's been a reverse migration where folks are moving back down south to places like Atlanta, Charleston, South Carolina. Um, they're moving back down south. And I think it's also, I want to point out here too that the Great Migration, we tend to think about specifically as like a Black movement, but it was Black and white people from the South looking for different opportunities. Um, however, white Southerners tended to re-migrate and go back home, which was more like migration, while the Black Southerners tended to move and stay in the enclaves of Detroit, for example, or Chicago. And I'm still looking for what I had
So
a,
I
yeah,
guess as you're looking for that, I guess I'm wondering though, in terms of Black tourism, then. So you have the Great Migration, and they're moving to cities like Detroit, like Chicago, and that sort of thing. But in terms of Black Americans, sort of just traveling for leisure, are numbers known about that, or are people just
I haven't,
making assumptions about how many Black folks were traveling at that time based on sort of who was using the Green Book? I'm just, has somebody studied this, or is this just, sorry? Yeah.
not that I know of. I don't know that we have a specific number, honestly. And a lot of like the theoretical grounding of my work is kind of based on
Okay.
understanding this like greater like Black diaspora, for example. Because I'm even thinking of in 1918, like Carter G. Woodson, who was the father of African American history. Um, he or considered so. He was writing about African Americans as a migratory group, but like and how they've been considered like naturally migratory. But the truth is, it was in order to find better opportunities and to always consistently find safer areas and to get away from dangerous situations and stuff. And so it was like a migration based on necessity more than anything. And so I think that, yeah, I that's definitely in the back, like my understanding of an overall Black diaspora, and as this constant movement, whether it's international or whether it's here in the US. That's kind of like always, that's like a theoretical, that's always foregrounding a lot of this work that I've been doing and kind of understanding that. But as far as hard numbers, like I don't have them. And I think that we can, looking at like census data can help. But even then, it's a matter of like who's actually been counted and accounted for in the archives as we're looking. And the trouble is, like some of these groups just don't exist and they haven't been counted for. And so hopefully this is like beginning to.
Yeah. So no, this is really helpful just in terms of thinking about how we understand travel, how we understand leisure, and who's being counted or how we can find out that information. Not only thinking about archives like sort of the Schomburg Center and thinking about looking at copies of the Green Book and analyzing those, right, to get a better sense of sort of what leisure was looking like for African Americans during this time of segregation. But I think too, you know, we always reference thinking about the end of segregation with Brown v. Board in 1954, but at the same time knowing sort of what was needed until we get to the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and then even thinking about knowing what was going on around even still de jure segregation and de facto segregation following the Civil Rights Act, right? And so thinking about how that operated. So besides the Green Book and in the work that was doing, how did folks know, like, were places explicitly advertising as sort of being anti-Black, right? Or were there other things signaling sort of like certain establishments were unsafe? Is it just mainly word of mouth
I
still
think
happening?
mainly word of mouth and kind of like the milieu of a place. I think could also, like, if you're traveling and you can kind of see that, I think it could also be that, and like just the sort of like visceral understanding of a place and kind of picking up on those signals is my guess. But yeah, that's my guess and how I kind of think about it.
Okay. No, I mean, I think that's super helpful, especially considering sort of even too how leisure time was even kind of built into society, really recognizing that, we didn't have what we understood as sort of a tourist industry or a leisure industry until certain barriers toward both democratizing travel,
Hmm.
right, were happening, but also too thinking about how various racial, ethnic, and social class communities. So here thinking about sort of wealthier Black Americans were able to sort of access that because we know so many Black folks were in um, uh, working relationships where they were actually tending to or caring for folks who were trying to go on vacation, right? So thinking about sort of the racial dynamics of travel. So I'm just in terms of a closing question, I guess for me is then how do you see sort of this work and your interest in understanding Black tourism fitting within your larger research project? Is this something that you were taking on separate from the work that you're doing as part of your doctoral research, or is this something you think that is a part of that?
For me, that's a great question. It actually works as being part of it. Um, because as I've been interested in the restaurant industry, I realize like when I'm thinking about the service class and the service industry, I have to understand the like Black Americans in the US and how they have been seen and treated as essentially the service class of the US, like from this stems back into slavery. And even I mean even in it wasn't until the 1960s even that like job opportunities went beyond like janitors and jobs like that, even for folks in Kalamazoo or Detroit, for Black folks in Michigan. And so it's always been very easy for Americans and white Americans to see and view Black Americans as part of a service industry, because it's just like naturally follows the way that the images and the imagery and the treatment. And so we have to figure out that. And so how I ended up looking at leisure as a form of resistance is because when you have a class that has been looked at as a service class and suddenly they're having fun and splashing in the water and they can afford their vacation time, that happiness and that pleasure is a form of resistance. It is a form of saying like, we're here, we've made it. And I think that some of those tensions really came out of that, and why folks thought it was so, like, why white folks thought it was uncomfortable, whether it was like 1919 in Chicago, 1943 Belle Isle. When you see, I think it was like that racial tension and that like flip of the script that had been ingrained and baked into US history that really drove this. And so, yeah, it's like as I'm interested in the service class, or in like servers in restaurants and cooks and stuff, I've just necessarily had to, I mean, you can't do that sort of work and understand it without understanding African American labor and leisure as well. It's very central to this story.
I think this is a perfect note to end on, Dani, and because you really highlight the way in which Black joy and Black pleasure is a form of resistance, especially thinking about not only the past and the time period that you examine today, but also thinking about present day, right? And so seeing celebrations of Black joy, Black leisure, Black tourism as a form of resistance and what that looks like is a really great takeaway from your presentation. So thank you so much. Thank you to those who were able to join us today. You will be receiving an email with a survey that we look forward to having you fill out. Again, this webinar was recorded and will be available online by the end of the week. And so stay tuned for more information there. We also have on our website, on the Kutsche office website, a digital programs hub where you're able to access all of our online programming. So thank you so much, Dani, for joining us. It was a really great opportunity to learn more about Black tourism and travel in Michigan, as well as the Green Book. Thank you so much.
Thank you.